Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and in this one, we're gonna flatten a curve. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so where we last left off, the Knight of Cups, that harbinger of change and excitements, both genuine and fraudulent, made himself known in the forms of Neck to Nebo and Fast Eddie Clark. And he did so when we were conveniently enough talking about whether or not books like Fast Eddie's Plato Codex or books like the Icelandic sagas and Eddas, with their inclusion of the Romvera saga, could be fictions or forgeries of the Catholic Church through the use of its monastic scriptorium system. Or maybe even that they could be the products of more modern forgers. Because even if the sagas and the Eddas can be reliably dated to the 12th and 13th centuries, that doesn't necessarily make them genuine. They could be 12th and 13th century fictions created by the church to pacify the Scandinavian populations they had just assimilated, once the Scandinavian kings got with the program and accepted their place in Christendom. Because what the sagas and the Eddas do is they give the local Scandinavians a historical national identity that they can call their own. And the idea of using mythology to create a national identity, like historians are now saying was deliberately done in the 1860s with these Scandinavian Vikings, an idea that they corrupted to supply the friction for the socio-political realm that they've set up for their subjects. Because that's what we are. We are just subjects to be studied and experimented on and data mined, so our controllers can have a better understanding of how to control us, right? And our appetites. Because as I said, our prime directive is to consume, right? And it's nice to see that not only is Nature magazine kind enough to clear up that whole Viking genome problem, they're also telling us what the future of human behavioral research is going to be. Isn't that special, right? And so I'm digressing, right? But this idea of using mythology to build a cultural identity isn't new to me, right? A big part of the Poe Chronicles was going to cover similar ground because in work I never got to share in that series, I learned that they had done the exact same thing to the Irish. Here's what the authors of In Search of Ancient Ireland say in the preface of their book. All right, so they say that Ireland has always been a place where myth and reality existed side by side, but the latest research is now making clear the distinction between them. This book is full of new information, some of it at odds with what many Irish descendants believe about their ancestral home. Interestingly, most of what we think of as Irish is rooted in when? The 19th century, right? It was then that Ireland began reinventing itself as a nation and culture separate from the occupying English. They say that the poets and writers of the Celtic revival reached back to the old Irish legends and stories to provide a cultural foundation for their newly emerging national identity. The term Celtic was little used prior to this time, so Ireland's view of itself as a Celtic nation is a modern invention. And so they continue that all this has meant that interest in Ireland and her ancient history has flourished in recent years, right? It's a cash cow, this Celtic mythology and this Celtic identity, right? Who knows how many, think of all the Celtic knot work that's out there and the Celtic tattoos that people get and so on and so on. I have a Celtic tattoo, for crying out loud. It's very popular, this Celtic history for Ireland, right? Even if what many people believe to be true comes more from the imagination of poets and storytellers than the rigorous scholarship of historians and archaeologists. That's a really incredible statement, right? If Celtic Ireland is a modern invention, then why couldn't Viking Scandinavia be? The similarities between the pagan Norse and the Irish Celts and how we know what we know about them shouldn't be discounted as coincidence, because it just seems like they're using the same tricks in both cases, basing much of what they, the historians, put out there about Celtic Ireland and about Viking Scandinavia. They base all of this on manuscripts created in scriptoriums. And Ireland may have had the finest scriptoriums in all the realm in what they tell us were the Dark Ages. And so I found this in Heritage Ireland, and it says that at that time, the Dark Ages, the growth of the church meant that there was a constant need to copy Bibles and other religious books that were brought to Ireland by Christian missionaries. As a result, ordinary monks in monastic complexes throughout Ireland had the monopoly of education. A monopoly of education. Quickly developing important schools and luring students from Britain and continental Europe. At the time, Ireland had a monopoly on education. So just think about what that means. Because, of course, as we were talking about, right, many of the early texts were produced specifically to aid in the process of conversion. Giving the locals some mythology and history to call their own helps this process because remember, what was one of the first things that invaders would do once they conquered a land? Right? They would change the names of the local people, severing crucial connections those people would have had with their past. Right? And in this case, we're talking about the Vikings, right? So you change their names and you teach them this new history you've provided for them, right, for a few generations, and voila! You can effectively erase an entire culture's history in 100 years or so, maybe less. That is, if you were so inclined to do so, and it certainly seems that way with the case of the Vikings and the Irish Celts. Right? This is just regional variations of the same story, and the mainstream keeps them closely related because remember, Aymar the Boneless, he dominated the Irish Sea, and the historians used the alleged Viking raids on England and Ireland as the basis for the Vikings' reputation as conquering warlords. And we've discussed what they've done with that reputation, right? But when talking about the authenticity of texts like the sagas or Fast Eddie's Plato Codex, we need to keep in mind that the idea of ancient documents or archaeological relics being forgeries is not just the province of crazed false paradigm speculators like myself, looking to prove our historical narrative is false. Oh no, right? Because the Dumbo-sized elephant sitting in every history and archaeology department's teacher's lounge is that the forging of ancient texts and artifacts is a very real problem in the academic world. All right, and this is an article published by the Friends of ASOR, which is the American Society of Overseas Research, founded in 1900 as the American School of Oriental Study and Research in Palestine. All right, so that's really interesting. All right, and I love that the American Society of Overseas Research is located at the James F. Strange Center, and it's on Commerce Street, because all of this is commerce, and it's in Alexandria. So Alexandria once again rearing its head here. And so this article is all about the forging of ancient texts, and I'm going to dive a bit deeper into it a little later down the line, but I found this article while putting together my failed masterpiece, Neolithically Delicious. And it was my own inability and then the pandemic that sidetracked this episode from being completed. And so what I was doing in this episode was I was exploring how we know what we know about Neolithic man. And work stopped just as I was about to delve into the site of Çatalhöyük itself and its discoverer, James Mellart. Or Jimmy, as I was calling him back then. Right? And Jimmy allegedly found this place in 1958, and he did 4 seasons worth of digs there between 1961 and 1965, at which time he was banned from working in Turkey because of his involvement in something called the Doric Affair. And so what he did was he published drawings of supposedly important Bronze Age artifacts that later went missing. And this is a very interesting story that I hope to tell in full one day, but spoiler alert, these Bronze Age artifacts may not have ever existed at all. And I also think it's interesting that the site lay dormant for almost 30 years until excavations began again in 1993 under this Ian Hodder. Right? And he's a very interesting character in and of himself. But it's amazing that this Viking story and the idea of Viking artifacts being forgeries or hoaxes brought me back here. Because whether the Doric artifacts were real or not, Jimmy was a forger. In 2018, Mellart's son Alan and the Swiss-German geoarchaeologist Eberhard Zanger published an investigation according to which Mellart had fabricated extensive forgeries in support of his thesis. After investigating the late Mellart's apartment, Zanger revealed that Mellart faked several of the ancient murals and may have run a forger's workshop of sorts. These forgeries include prototypes of murals and engravings that Mellart had claimed to have discovered at Çatalhöyük. How much of what they tell us is true about Çatalhöyük is based on Jimmy Mellart's extensive forgeries? Is Big Mama one of Jimmy's forgeries? Because remember, this is allegedly one of the oldest known representations of a mother goddess in her role as mistress of the animals, or as they call her in Baltimore, Diana, right? And I think it's interesting, it says here that the head is a restoration, implying that this is her real head, and they just fixed it up. And I'm not buying that for a second, with all we know about Jimmy the Forger and how Çatalhöyük could fit into the plans of the X Club. And I cover the X Club in that Neolithically Delicious episode, right? And it was founded by Thomas Henry Huxley here on November 3rd, which is a 33, and this was in 1864, right? And it was a dining club of 9 men who supported the theories of natural selection and academic liberalism, united by a devotion to science pure and free, untrammeled by religious dogma. And its members are believed to have wielded much influence over scientific thought. And not only in science, but history as well, as is the case with ex-club member John Lubbock, the Right Honorable Lord Avebury. And he comes from a very wealthy English banking family, and he was a liberal politician, philanthropist, scientist, and of course, he was a polymath, right? And he made significant contributions in archaeology, ethnography, think about what we're talking about here in this series, and several branches of biology. And he coined the terms Paleolithic and Neolithic. It was men like Lubbock and Thomas Henry Huxley and organizations like the X Club that created just about everything we think we know about history and science. Right? And that's not an overstatement. At least not in the Mud City paradigm it isn't. Because smart polymaths like the members of the X Club here surely knew that if you were going to effectively create a false historical narrative, you were going to need some physical evidence to back that up. Evidence like what your antiquarian societies and their agents, like Fast Eddie, have been bringing back home for decades now. Evidence that could be forged or faked. Because who knows how big a lead the Royal Society has given all these other learned societies and social clubs. And I love that it says here that the Royal Society, that they are the independent scientific academy of the UK, dedicated to promoting excellence in science for the benefit of humanity. And of course, this is interesting because the charter says, we have long and fully resolved with ourself to extend not only the boundaries of the empire, but also the very arts and sciences, creating arts and sciences to benefit the empire. It has nothing to do with the benefit of humanity, but the benefit of the crown. And I think it's also interesting that this says it's the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge. Improving is such a subjective word. Improving it by whose standards, right? Just how greatly has life improved in the almost 400 years since the Royal Society was chartered? Since science and history have taken over academia in the 18th and 19th centuries? Or has it left us corrupted, beholden and enslaved to its technologies and unnatural medicines? And all of these questions are just as subjective as the idea of what improving natural science could mean, right? But one thing is clear to Mud City, and that's that groups like the X Club and others like it are more responsible for shaping our historical narrative than the evidence may ever be, because getting back to that ASOR article, it may be impossible to tell what's real and what's fake in the terms of archaeological artifacts, because forgeries, as I said, are a real problem in modern academia. And so she says that the surest way to verify the authenticity of ancient documents is to determine if they were recovered from secure archaeological contexts. In contrast, the antiquities market is how most modern hoaxes are circulated, including forgeries of ancient texts. Alleged ancient texts are often said to come from particular archaeological sites, but there is rarely a way to verify such assertions. All right, she continues that, right, there are various motivations for forging ancient documents, notably money, ego, and ideology, including religious and political motivations. The most obvious fact is that the ancient inscriptions often sell for large amounts of money on the antiquities market, with tiny scraps of papyri no more than an inch long going for hundreds of dollars. Also, individuals who have been ostracized within academic circles, purged from academic programs, or who were never recognized in the first place might wish to deceive their former and would-be colleagues. Sabotage! That's unbelievable. And just think about what part that could play in what we believe about our historical artifacts. And here's an example of what a tiny scrap of forged papyri looks like. All right, this is the alleged Gospel of Jesus' wife. And this is a very small fragment. All right, so let's compare it to what they tell us is a genuine fragment of Plato's Republic. And so I don't know how they determined that this is the genuine article here versus this forgery over here. But, who's to say that this Plato fragment isn't a forgery, right? Artificially aged in a manner not far removed from how I speculate they could have aged the Calvaire papers in the Cooking the Books episodes, right? It could be. Because remember that there are various motivations for forging these documents, like creating a false history, right? And any good forger, like, say, Jimmy Mellart, whose forgery workshop apparently ran for decades, they have tricks that are pretty slick. Because getting back to that ASOR article, the author talks about how they tell the difference between the genuine thing and a fake. She says that in the past, forgeries could be readily detected by scientific methods. For example, any ancient object recovered from the ground, as well as any ancient inscription written on such an object, will be covered with a patina, a film that accrues on an object over time as a result of various chemical processes, such as oxidation and calcification. Patinas can be analyzed spectroscopically. The holy ghost of spectroscopy, is how they date this fake history, right? And, going back to the master of reality, all of these things are connected. It's just unbelievable. Right? So these patinas can be analyzed spectroscopically to determine their precise chemical makeup and whether they include any modern elements. However, forgers with the proper means who wish to bolster the authenticity of their products can now forge patinas using ancient organic materials that would pass various scientific tests, I guess that's supposed to be, right? Such as carbon-14 dating. And again, how does a typo like that get by, the editor or whatever? Ancient organic materials can also be used to produce ancient links with which to create inscriptions. As the resources for producing forgeries improve, forgers are better equipped than ever to defraud the unwary. Or the overzealous historian or scientist, I imagine. And so these forgeries can pass carbon-14 dating tests, can they? Exactly how hard is that to do? How accurate is carbon-14 dating? And are there other methods of scientific testing than carbon-14 dating? Because that seems to be the only one I ever hear about, right? And so this is what the gatekeepers tell us about carbon-14 dating. Radiocarbon dating was created by this guy, Willard Libby, right, in 1946, and its first successful tests took place in 1949, when he accurately dates a series of objects with already known ages. And this is him taking notes in a nicely staged photograph, standing next to some very scientific-looking doodads that look more like leftovers from the set of James Whale's The Bride of Frankenstein than they do actual scientific instruments, I guess, right? But he's got a great story. He was born to some poor Colorado farmers because, of course he was, right? His family moves to California when he's very young. I think he was 5. But he's a bright young man who attends the University of California at Berkeley, where he receives his bachelor's in chemistry in 1931 and his doctorate in 1933. And he's just getting started. He's so good at chemistry that during the World War Gateway, he worked in the Manhattan Project's Substitute Alloy Materials Laboratories at Columbia University, developing the gaseous diffusion process for uranium enrichment. And this leads to his professorship at the University of Chicago, where he leads the Institute for Nuclear Studies. And this is where he develops the carbon-14 technique of radiocarbon dating. He also discovered that tritium, similarly, this is awkward, right? Could be used for dating water, right? He could date water, right? So therefore, they could date wine. Right? And in 1950, he became a member of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. And he was appointed a commissioner in 1954, becoming its sole scientist. Sole scientist on the General Advisory Committee? How legit could this General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission be if they only had one scientist? This to me adds a little currency to the idea that atomic or nuclear energy is a scam, as other channels have covered. And so if forgers can trick carbon-14 dating, maybe these tests that took place in 1949 were rigged for successful results. I mean, it's certainly possible, right? And so they tell us that radiocarbon dating works by measuring the rate of decay of carbon-14 found in plant and animal remains, and that carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. Yet this process can reliably date things going back 50,000 years, and I love this, that with special preparation methods, they can occasionally make accurate analysis of older samples. How? What are these special preparation methods that they need? And correct me if I'm wrong, but if the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, well then, wouldn't all the carbon-14 be used up in 11,460 years? Or double that? Because I'm not sure how half-lives work, right? So are they saying that the rate of decay is constant per half, so that it's 5,700 years for the first half, and then it's 5,700 years for half of the second half, or a quarter of the original amount, and then it's 5,700 years for the next eighth of that original whole, and then the next 16th, and so on, and so on, like a Fabergé shampoo commercial? It seems like a stretch, right? And how do they determine how much carbon-14 something had when it died? But fear not, they have a calibration curve for that. But the problem with this calibration curve is that it needs constant correcting. Corrections must be made to account for the proportion of carbon-14 in different types of organisms. Fractionation, they call that, right? And the varying levels of carbon-14 throughout the biosphere. Reservoir effects. Additional complications come from the burning of fossil fuels such as coal and oil, and from the above-ground nuclear tests done in the 50s and 60s. Because the time it takes to convert biological materials to fossil fuels is substantially longer than the time it takes for its carbon-14 to decay below detectable levels. Fossil fuels contain almost no carbon-14. As a result, beginning in the late 19th century, again, right, there was a noticeable drop in the proportion of carbon-14 as the carbon dioxide generated from burning fossil fuels began to accumulate in the atmosphere. Conversely, nuclear testing increased the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere, which reached a maximum in about 1965 of almost double the amount present in the atmosphere prior to nuclear testing. All right, so there's a lot going on here, right? They're scapegoating both the oil industry and its fossil fuel hoax, as well as the atomic thing, right? And if there's any truth to that they doubled the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere in 20 years, from 1945 to 1965, with all these nuclear tests, that's one hell of a carbon footprint, right? So it makes me think that, could all of this climate change just be the powers that be passing the buck on how much damage they did in the 50s and 60s on this, and guilting the present generation into taking responsibility for this, escaping any blame or cost of cleanup. That's, if there's anything to the global warming thing, and personally, I don't think there is, but if there is, this is very interesting, almost as interesting as where all this carbon-14 comes from, because carbon-14 comes from the cosmos. Well, naturally, of course it comes from the cosmos. Right? Radiocarbon is constantly being created in the Earth's atmosphere by the interaction of cosmic rays with atmospheric nitrogen. And so cosmic rays, aside from giving the Fantastic Four their powers, cosmic rays are high-energy protons and atomic nuclei that move through space at nearly the speed of light. Not at the speed of light, nearly, close, right? And they originate from the sun, whose rays do travel at the speed of light. So curious that the cosmic rays are a little slower. They come from outside of the solar system in our own galaxy and from distant galaxies. Upon impact with the Earth's atmosphere, cosmic rays produce showers of secondary particles, some of which reach the surface, although the bulk is deflected off into space by the magnetosphere, X-Men, X-Club, anyone, right? Or the heliosphere, Fantastic Four, it's just unbelievable. And this is allegedly an image of a cosmic ray? I don't know. But since Mud City is a paradigm that precludes the existence of a vast universe as they present it to us, this carbon-14 story is getting harder and harder to believe, especially with all the special help radiocarbon dating seems to need to be accurate. If your tests or experiments only work under special circumstances, that doesn't make them trustworthy. All the shifting variables make it seem more like sleight of hand, like a magic trick, right? And the magic thing about cosmic rays is that they were discovered in 1912 by one Victor Franz Hess, right? Who just so happened to be born in a medieval castle in Austria that dates back to the 14th century or the 1300s. Waldstein Castle, right? Where his father was keeper of the forest. Right? Are you kidding me? That's just incredible, right? From the puzzle tree to Poe, the forest will not be denied, right? And it's interesting that Waldstein Castle is considered a bohemian paradise today. And so I'm getting ready to wrap this one up here. We're going to close out with a quick look at what else the gatekeepers have to say about the accuracy of radiocarbon or carbon-14 dating, right? The New York Times published this article 32 years ago on May 31st, 1990. All right, and this is what they had to say back then. Since 1947, scientists have reckoned the ages of many old objects by measuring the amount of radioactive carbon they contain. New research, and this is in 1990, new research shows, however, that some estimates based on carbon may have erred by thousands of years. Yeah, try 3,500 years, according to their findings, right? And again, 1990, the Lamont Doherty Geological Laboratory of Columbia University reported today in the British Journal of Nature, again, it's just unbelievable the presence that nature has, the power that Nature magazine has in the scientific community. It just can't be understated. And of course, all this makes me wonder what all this could mean for the Bones Richard right? And the Times Magazine article goes on to say that, it is too soon to know whether the discovery will seriously upset the estimated dates of events like the arrival of human beings in the Western Hemisphere. Right? So again, they're anticipating that they're going to have to change the story, right? But it is already clear that the carbon method of dating will have to be recalibrated and corrected in some cases, which they have done multiple times. And the main adjustment that they made was the use of dendrochronology, right? The measurement of age by tree ring, because they say that accurate tree ring records of age are available for a period extending 9,000 years into the past. But the tree ring record goes no further. So scientists have sought other indicators of age against which carbon dates can be compared. Right? And then this is where they get into the uranium-thorium dating method used by the Lamont Doherty group. But if the best gauge that they have is a standard that only goes back 9,000 years, it's no wonder that they keep having to change this. It's no wonder you have to keep recalibrating your curve, right? And Scientific American tells us that they last did this in 2020, and before then in 2013. So twice in the last 10 years, they recalibrated their radiocarbon dating calibration curve. And this new one, called IntCal 20, draws from nearly twice the data of the previous curve from 2013. And presumably the 2013 curve had more data than the earlier curves, and I couldn't find anything about whether they had recalibrated their curve between 1990 and 2013, but surely they did. But this exponential growth in data makes me wonder how many ancient artifacts, books, bones, or otherwise, are sporting dates from these earlier faulty curves. The dates could be wrong on hundreds, if not thousands of artifacts. And these dates are accepted as fact by mainstream academia. That's absolutely crazy. And so what it boils down to is, how much trust does one put in these ever-changing parameters, or in the people who use them, or created them? In my brief reading on Wilbur Libby, I could find no mention of him belonging to a fraternity or other Masonic order, but you better believe he's a connected guy somehow, or he wouldn't be working on the Manhattan Project or all the other nuclear projects that were to follow. And so I'm going to close this one out with an unintentional cherry. And that's when I Googled the author of the ASOR article on the forging of ancient texts, Heather Dana Davis Parker, and I think it's interesting that the name Parker keeps popping up. I found out that she received her master's and doctorate in Near Eastern Studies from none other than Johns Hopkins University. Of course she did, right? Because everything runs through Baltimore eventually. Right? And so I thought it would be fun to Google Johns Hopkins and fraud. And what came up dealt with, big surprise, healthcare fraud, mostly centered around shady medical billing practices. But I found one story that chilled me to my bones when I read it. Right, this story here, right, published in the Washington Post on unbelievably March 11th, right, another 33, right, and this was in 2013, right, and it's titled, "Doubts About Johns Hopkins Research Have Gone Unanswered, Scientist Says." And it's the story of how members of the Molecular Biology and Genetics Lab falsified its research in order to get published in none other than, right, Nature magazine. This is getting ridiculous here. And so they claim to have discovered the key mechanism for maintaining cell energy balance, believed to be linked to cellular aging and cancer. And this was a big deal for Johns Hopkins and its Molecular Biology and Genetics Lab. Not only did publication in Nature magazine carry academic prestige, right? Publication meant that no one was going to come around and audit their work and keep that National Institute of Health grant money coming in, of which Johns Hopkins receives more than $600 million a year. And so Johns Hopkins doesn't want anyone messing with this revenue stream, right? But unfortunately for Johns Hopkins, and fortunate for us, there was a whistleblower on this research team. A guy named Daniel Wan, a scientist with integrity, that rare creature. And he was responsible for double-checking the numbers, and he knew that the numbers that the lead on the team, Yu Yi Lin, was going to submit for publication were all wrong. And Daniel tried to let people know this, but none of his colleagues or even the head of the department cared, because the research was going to be published, securing the department its grant money. But Daniel was relentless, right? And he bellyached enough about this that it got him fired. Right? He was escorted off the premises on December 15th, 2011 by 2 armed security guards. And this was just about 2 months before the paper was to be published in Nature magazine. And Hopkins was over the moon about this publication, right? They issued a press release called "Studies Linked to Better Understanding of Cancer Drugs," right? Touting the success of this research, which goes on to be cited, this is unbelievable, 11 times by other publications by other published papers building on the findings, right? And this is just in the first year of its publication. But still, Daniel doesn't give up, appealing to both Nature magazine and Johns Hopkins University that the research is wrong, going so far as suing Johns Hopkins. And just when it looks like Yu Yi Lin is finally going to address this issue, he turns up dead from an apparent suicide. In August, Yu Yi Lin, the lead author of the paper, was found dead in his new lab in Taiwan. Conveniently, they transferred him out of Baltimore, right? That there was a puncture mark in his left arm and empty vials of sedatives and muscle relaxants around him.
How convenient!
And so, of course, they play his suicide off as being related to all the stress of the fraud allegations. But my apophenia tells me that maybe an agent with the best interests of Johns Hopkins at heart took care of this little problem before the reputation and revenue stream could be damaged. And unbelievably, in the end, Johns Hopkins and Nature magazine win out. Because Daniel doesn't stop after Yu Yi Lin's death, right? Appealing to the federal government, who paid for all of this fraudulent research, and they dismiss it, saying that if there was a problem, the problem was with Yu Yi Lin, and since he's dead, there's no longer a problem, right? So, of course, nothing could be further from the truth, because this article points out that it may be impossible for anyone outside to know the extent of the problems in the Nature paper. But the incident comes amid a phenomena that some call a retraction epidemic. Last year, research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that the percentage of scientific articles retracted because of fraud had increased tenfold since 1975. The same analysis reviewed more than 2,000 retracted biomedical papers and found that 67% of the retractions were attributed to misconduct, mainly fraud or suspected fraud. So that's 1,340 of these papers. And this is 2013 we're talking about here, and that's just the retracted ones. Who knows how many fraudulent studies are out there undetected thanks to publication bias? Yet we're supposed to trust the science when scientists and scientific institutions have proven time and again that they are anything but trustworthy, serving themselves before others. Certainly Johns Hopkins would never put their agendas before the science, would they? Alright, so that's all I have for this one. We're going to pick it up in the next curve flattening episode, Fired in the Forge of the Fat Man. Remember guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. So until the next one, cheers.